Good evening, everyone. I'm Patrick Lewis, the President and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, and especially to Dinsmore and Scholl LLP for sponsoring our 2025 Dine and Dialogue series. We are very glad to have a number of representatives of the firm join us tonight for this important conversation at an important time in our local and national history. It is my honor and privilege now tonight to introduce our speaker. Michael Tackett is an award-winning journalist with more than 3 decades of experience covering national politics, including 9 presidential elections. He is currently the Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. Let's welcome him.
Hello, everyone. It is a real privilege to be here. I hadn't been in this beautiful building before, and what an amazing thing to have a historical society that is 140 years old. That says a lot about the community of Louisville, how it values its history, how it looks at its highs and its lows in its history, so we can all have a better understanding of things. So it's truly a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and a privilege. I had a couple of people I wanted to single out who were kind enough to come down from Indianapolis to come to this. 2 old college friends, John Onimus and Kevin Betts. And, you know, we had lunch at Jack Fry's, so it's already been a great day in Louisville. So, most of the time when I've been to Louisville to research the book, I found myself in the McConnell Center archives, and it was very glamorous. I was sitting there by myself in a study carrel, and Nan Mosher would wheel out another box, and it would have another set of documents. And then I might be looking at a kindergarten report card. I might be looking at a high school essay, or I might be looking at the strategy for confirming Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court. But it was all really a very fulfilling thing to do. I thought I'd start with kind of the origin of the book and how it came about, because people sometimes find that interesting. So even though I've been covering national politics for a long time and been full-time in Washington since 1992, one political figure I didn't know and had never interviewed was Mitch McConnell. But I knew that I wanted to do a biography, and we were trying to think of who. And my agent actually suggested, he goes, "What about Mitch McConnell?" And my initial reaction was, what about that? Because I wasn't really sure about that. But then we talked about it. We talked about, think about how consequential Mitch McConnell has been. And consequential can be seen in a positive or negative light, depending upon your point of view. But there's no doubt that he is one of the most consequential political figures of the 21st century. So that alone made him interesting, for me to try to study. And so that's what I set out to do. It's really humbling to think about writing a biography, because you're trying to capture the fullness of someone's life who also happens to be alive. So that's a little different than somebody who's passed and you're looking only at archival information, and many of their peers may no longer be with us. But in this case, that wasn't how it worked. So I decided to approach him about doing the biography. And not only did I not know him, I really didn't know that much of Team Mitch, which is a famous political organization. I guess that was a shortcoming on my part, but I did know one person. And that one person said, your timing may be just right. And then I said, okay, how would we like to proceed? And so he apparently broached the idea with the senator, and he said, well, he'd like to meet you. So I said, okay, can't lose anything doing that. So we went, and I had a meeting, and this was in his leader's office, which, for those of you who have been there, it's just a projection of power and authority. Big desks, heavy furniture, historic photographs, everything about it has an aura of power. And there were about 12 different aides sitting around couches and chairs, all of them kind of shooting darts at me, wondering, who is this guy? What is he doing? What's going on? So I decided, well, I have nothing to lose here. So I just was very straightforward with Senator McConnell after I broke the ice with him, talking about the Brooklyn Dodgers and baseball, things that I thought I knew we had common ground. Then I got right to the point and I said, I'm not interested in doing a screed from the left or a screed from the right. I'm interested in doing an honest, objective account of your life and career, just following the facts. And I said, there's only one condition that I would have to place on that, and that is I would have total editorial control. Because if I didn't have total editorial control, people would say it wasn't credible. And if it wasn't credible, it wouldn't be worth doing. So halfway through the meeting, Senator McConnell looks at me and says, I'll cooperate with you. I was a little stunned by that. And then he said, and I've got these archives. Do you suppose those would be of interest to you? And then he said, and I'll tell people to talk to you who otherwise wouldn't talk to you. And I thought, I better get out of this room as fast as I can because it can't get any better than this. And as I was leaving, I said to the person who had brokered the meeting, I said, boy, that was a little more than I expected. And he goes, that was a lot more than I expected. So that set me off on a 3.5-year journey of doing the book. And as many of you know who know Senator McConnell, control is a fairly important thing to him. He likes to have control. And in this particular situation, he didn't. And so we navigated that relationship. And one way that manifested itself was he heard that I was going to go to Warm Springs, Georgia to do some research. The reason I was going to Warm Springs, Georgia, for those who don't know, that's where Franklin Roosevelt had established the nation's premier polio rehabilitation institute. And of course, Senator McConnell had polio as a child. So he found out that I was going and he goes, well, I might as well go with you because it'll save a lot of time. So I said, okay, let's do it. So we boarded a flight to Atlanta. And it is true that when you're with the then Senate leader, you do get around places pretty quickly because he's got a driver and they go wherever they need to. And we went to Warm Springs and we got to see the grounds, and where FDR was, the little White House. And it gave you kind of a picture of what he had gone through in a sense, way back in the 1940s. And after that, we went to 5 Points, Alabama. And 5 Points, Alabama is where his mother was living when he contracted polio. His father was deployed to World War II, and his mother was staying with her sister there because she just needed that connection. She needed some support. But then all of a sudden, her 2-year-old is complaining that his finger hurts. And she doesn't know what it is, but he won't stop complaining about it. And so she takes him to a local doctor and he says, it's just an infection, don't worry about it. So then she notices that his limbs start to become clammy. And there's some stiffness that seems to be setting in. She gets really scared. And many of you remember that in the 1940s, polio was something that just struck fear in the hearts of American parents because it was indiscriminate, it touched so many lives, and there was no cure, there was no vaccine. So she knew she had to do something else. So she took him to another doctor who quickly diagnosed it as polio and set up the appointment at Warm Springs. When they went to Warm Springs, the therapist decided that he shouldn't be an inpatient. His case wasn't that severe. On the other hand, he would have to undergo some very rigorous therapy. That therapy was 4 times a day, 45 minutes a day. His mother performed manual exercises on his legs that she had learned from the people at Warm Springs. But there was another part about this. He's 2 years old, so he's obviously a child who runs around and all that. And she was instructed that he should not walk because the medical guidance at the time was that would impede his recovery from the polio. So you have to tell a 2-year-old not to walk. And that was his situation for 2 years, which is, kind of unimaginable now when you think about it. Some later research that I found indicated that, maybe 1 year at the maximum, maybe 8 months at the maximum. But at the time, that was pretty standard guidance. So he would spend a lot of time by himself in that room. And one of the things he did was he drew like a train along the baseboard of the room. And his mother, who was a real perfectionist, was aghast. She thought, oh no, you can't do that. But apparently his aunt thought it was great and did not want him to wash the walls. Now, when I went there, the walls had been washed. There was no longer the train, but you sort of get the sense of it. And I bring this up because polio was, in my view and in my research, a really signal event in his life for a lot of different reasons. I ended up reading, I got kind of obsessed with this, and I read 2 or 3 different books and then a bunch of memoirs from people who had had polio in that era. And there are some really notable commonalities among polio survivors. One was they were super strivers. Once they were quote unquote normal, which is how they refer to themselves, if you were ambulatory and didn't have too many physical limitations. The second thing was that they had a fear of failure. A third trait was they were very brittle about criticism. Senator McConnell really checks all those boxes in a lot of ways, but certainly that of a super striver is true. It turns out that a lot of famous athletes had polio as children. The Olympic track star Wilma Rudolph, the swimmer Johnny Weissmuller, actors like Mia Farrow and Alan Alda, the legendary Washington Post editor Ben Bradley. Ben Bradley had a big barrel chest because he used to exercise like FDR did just to try to strengthen his upper body because he had a weak leg. And he would always play doubles tennis instead of singles tennis because he couldn't move around that well. So that's where Senator McConnell starts out, with kind of an interesting psychological profile, but also the feeling that things are fine now. He gets out of treatment after 2 years. In his memoir, he tells this story, he gets to buy his first pair of shoes. And like so many people who had polio, he started to put it in the rearview mirror. Like, I'm normal, I'm fine, it's okay. Well, I mean, as life played out, that really wasn't the case. I mean, he had an extraordinary career, is having an extraordinary career, but he has had physical limitations. One of the things he wanted to do, like all of us, was to be a baseball player. And when he was younger, he played in Augusta, Georgia, and it was kind of a sandlot league, but the local paper would write long, dutiful stories about Mitch McConnell's 11 strikeouts or Mitch McConnell's home run. And so he started to think he was pretty good. And he came up to Louisville, and he did really well in what they called the Pony League. And then he went to Manual High School and didn't make his high school team. And one of the reasons was he had difficulty running. And this is something that happened to him when he was drafted or when he entered the Army Reserves. That also happened, where he ends up leaving the Army Reserves. The diagnosis was optic neuritis, but as McConnell himself said, he had a real challenge keeping up with people on the drills. But he goes along fine, and it doesn't seem to be a big deal. But the other part of polio that researchers started to notice in the early 1980s was there was a group of polio survivors who kept coming up with these strange symptoms. A lot of it was fatigue or weakness in a limb. And it got a name. Like, by about 1984, doctors were calling this post-polio syndrome. And it affected people in different ways to different degrees. And Senator McConnell never really acknowledged that that's what he had, except in 1995, he began doing oral histories with a Kentucky historian. And he went back and, reviewed his life. And one of the things he said was, there's this thing they talk about called post-polio syndrome. I don't know if I have it, but in 1985, I started to notice some weakness in my leg. So I think, at least in the back of his mind, he knew that. And so he progresses with his career, does the parades like every politician does, no real physical limitations, but also no real marathon running or anything like that either. And then fast forward now to later in life, when Senator McConnell, you may remember, fell and had a very bad concussion. He was at a hotel in Washington and had a fall in a restroom, and it was very, very serious. His aides were really worried that, whether or not he was even going to make it. the concussion was that bad. As I say in the book, I mean, his head hit with such force that he lost his hearing aids. So you can imagine that. And he's older and it's a concussion. And if anybody that's had a concussion or knows friends that have had them, it takes a long time for them to heal. And when you're older, it can take even longer. So that really hurt him. Even recently, you know, he's fallen a couple of times. But when he fell after the time in the hotel, he's taken to the hospital, and then they said, okay, there's no brain bleed. You're going to be okay, but you're going to have to undergo a lot of physical therapy. So he has to stay in the hospital for 2 weeks, which is not something a man who likes control wanted to be told, that you have to stay in the hospital for 2 weeks. But he did it, and he underwent that physical therapy every day. So almost 80 years after the fact, the proximate cause of what put him in a bedroom by himself at age 2 had come to affect him later in his life. So that's why I think polio is sort of a through line in studying Mitch McConnell. The purpose of this book, you know, people say everybody wants to look at it through some kind of a political lens, and I tried really hard not to do that, because my purpose wasn't to deify him or to crucify him. It was to understand him and then try to explain him in the book. So that's what I've tried to do. As we know, you know, Mitch McConnell has lived his life as a closed book. So now there's a bit more of an open book. And I'm very grateful for his cooperation in the book. He sat with me for more than 50 hours of interviews. And this is from someone whose advice to his Senate colleagues has always been, just because there's a microphone there doesn't mean you have to speak. He thinks that the less said, the better. He chooses his words like they're gemstones. He knows exactly what he wants to say, very rarely misspeaks, because he's that calibrated. So this was an experience for him. And I look at it as kind of a study in power, how he acquired power, then how he accumulated power, how he used it, and then how that power waned. And he starts in the Senate, which was a lifelong goal of his. I don't know how many people grow up wanting to be a US Senator, but he was certainly one of them. One person told me that when he was a student at the University of Louisville, he carried a business card that said Mitch McConnell, US Senator. And I could never find that card in the archives, so I didn't put it in the book, but the story's just too good. It's got to be true. So I went with that. But he knew what he wanted to do. And then he has this magic win in 1984, an upset win. He's the only person to defeat a Democratic incumbent. And this was a Reagan landslide year for sure. But Senator McConnell's view was he won this on his own with his own hard work, and that Reagan was sort of incidental to that. There's some other people who take a different view and think that Reagan probably did help a little bit. Nonetheless, Mitch McConnell finally got to where he wanted to be in the United States Senate. So he goes into the chamber and he goes to the far back corner where the least senior person sits. And unlike most people who get elected to the United States Senate, look in the mirror every morning and think, I'm going to be president of the United States. Mitch McConnell was not one of those people. He looked down at the well of the Senate and saw the leaders and said, I want to be the majority leader of the United States Senate. A curious goal, but one that he was fixated on and was willing to work for years and years and years to achieve. A real key to his longevity in the Senate, I think, was the 1990 Senate race. He's running against a very credible opponent, Harvey Sloan, well-known, popular person in Louisville. And it really started to show how Mitch McConnell knew the tactical way to win. It may not be the way that everybody would like it. It may not be a Hallmark card, but it's extremely successful. And his MO on this is you never run against the perfect person. Everybody has a record. You just have to find that record, and then you exploit that record and compare it to your own, and then voters will make up their mind. Now, one of the most fun things I found in the archives involved that 1990 Senate race. So I'm thumbing through, and all of a sudden I see a check, a campaign contribution to Senator McConnell. And the campaign contribution is for $1,000, and he's running for reelection. So you want to get these contributions. And it was signed Donald J. Trump. At the time, Mr. Trump was having some trouble financially. There were stories about bankruptcies in his casinos and various other things. And Senator McConnell wrote him back a note and said, as someone who's had financial struggles of my own, I really think you need this money more than I do. And he returned the check. So you can imagine when I'm thumbing through the archives and I see this check from Donald Trump, I'm thinking, I have to put this in the book. There has to be some way to do this. It has to work. But also then is when he started to found the McConnell Center. And as I said earlier, he started to do these oral histories in 1995, which made me think this is also somebody who wanted to have his life studied. He wanted to have a life and a career that was worthy of study. And so he was at least thinking about it at that time. And he acquired power in a lot of different ways. One of them was he did unpopular things. Most politicians will tell you they don't really like campaign finance reform because that will give an advantage to their challengers if you're an incumbent. Well, McConnell wasn't worried about that. So he opposed campaign finance reform. He learned all the arcane rules of the Senate and he mastered them and used them to tactical advantage for the Republican Party. He also then took on the role of being the chairman of the Republican Senate Campaign Committee. And that starts to seed this idea that he's invested in his colleagues' success in the way that, to some of them, the way that matters most. He's helping them raise money. He's helping them get reelected. But that helps to build relationships. And it also helped sharpen his tactical skills as a politician. So that was a good thing that he did. He was willing to go through the long slog of climbing up the leadership ladder. And it's not easy because in that era, the Republican Party was always famously known for the Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. It's like if you're the next person in line, then you get the job. You just have to wait your turn. And as we know, by the average age of the United States Senate, waiting your turn could take a really long time because those people can be really old. So he got to be number 2. And then finally, he got to be number 1. And he got to be the leader of his party. And this was something that, was a lifelong goal achieved. And he wasn't going to squander that opportunity. There's a lot of Democrats in particular, and even some Republicans, criticized the way that he initially used that power. This is around the time that Barack Obama is elected to the White House. And there were a couple of things there that were interesting. One was his immediate reflections in his oral history were very positive. He thought it was a great thing that the country had elected a Black president. He thought there was a lot of promise for the country. His very good friend, John Hayburn, wrote him a letter and said, I think you can do great things. This is what great people do. It didn't play out that way. And for a couple of reasons. One of them was Senator McConnell was worried at that point that the Republican Party was on a road to extinction because the prevailing political theory was there's this coalition of the ascendant, younger voters, people of color, and they were going to demographically just get bigger and bigger and bigger, which would be very bad for the Republican Party. But he's the leader of the party and he can't just, wave a white flag of surrender. So he convinces his party, that there's one real power that they have, and it's the power to say no. Because in the Senate, you can stop something with the filibuster. And if the other side doesn't have 60 votes, you can stop something in its tracks. There's one story that gets repeated a lot about Senator McConnell that I'd like to clarify. So he was criticized quite a bit for saying at one point that his goal was to make sure that Barack Obama was a one-term president. So I went back and read the entire interview. And it is true that that's what he said. But it's also true that what he said later in the interview was, I don't want him to fail. I just want him to change. So I asked him about that. And this was very revealing to me in terms of kind of how his mind works politically, how he thinks. And he said, that was very calculated. The first thing he said about the one-term president was for the conservative base of the party. The second thing about not wanting him to fail, wanting him to change, was for the more independent-minded swing voter. So as I said before, he rarely, says something that he hasn't thought out. But he deserves, I think, to have that fully explained, because too often people have stopped with he wanted him to be a one-term president. And there's a fuller explanation. Now, you may not like the politics of his explanation, but that's what he did. And I think he deserves credit for that. The other thing he did was he blocked a lot of federal judges from being confirmed that President Obama had nominated. And this story will probably start to sound familiar to some people because it's, kind of the age that we live in. And then the Democratic leader, Harry Reid, at the time, decided that he was going to get rid of the filibuster for federal judges, for district court judges. And this was a big change for the Senate, because the Senate prides itself on its folkways and rules and why it's different from the House. And Senator McConnell said to him, excuse me, he said, "You're going to rue the day that you did that. And probably sooner than you think." Well, he was certainly seeing around a corner there, because one of his most controversial decisions came in 2016 in February, when Justice Antonin Scalia had died. And Senator McConnell and his wife, Secretary Elaine Chao, had just landed for a vacation in the Caribbean. Now, part of this, you may be wondering, I just don't really necessarily see Senator McConnell sitting on the beach with a umbrella drink in his hand, but maybe he would. But in this particular case, he went right into work mode. And he got in touch with his staff and he said, "We've got to put out a statement soon to say Barack Obama is not going to fill that Senate seat, or that Supreme Court seat, pardon me." So that was a monumental decision of its own, because he was not only denying him a vote, he was denying him even a hearing to be on the Supreme Court. And that hadn't been done before. Now, Senator McConnell is a lawyer. However, he said very early on, he hated being a lawyer. He found it boring. He didn't want to do it. And he did it for like a year or so, and then finally got a political opportunity. But for somebody who didn't want to be a lawyer, he's a very good litigator, especially in the political space. So his argument was, there's the Biden rule that says you don't put somebody on the court if the Senate and the White House are of different parties. You just don't do that. So I thought, well, I should look up this Biden rule. And there isn't a Biden rule. Biden did say that, something to that effect, but he never did anything about it. He never acted on it. But Senator McConnell had the enough of a rationale from his perspective to go ahead and do what he did. And he did that. That set in motion blowing up the filibuster for Supreme Court judges, which led to the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, and then Brett Kavanaugh, and then finally Amy Coney Barrett. And of course, Amy Coney Barrett was nominated only 6 weeks before an election. But to Senator McConnell's thinking, he's consistent because at this point, the White House and the Senate are of the same party. So he can do that. Now, there are plenty of people who don't like that explanation, that are unsatisfied with that explanation. Those of you who've read the book will know where I come down on that. And that's just an area where Senator McConnell and I disagree. I mean, I described it as kind of a brutish exercise of power. He thinks he was fully within his rights to do it. And he said, in his mind, there's no doubt the Democrats would have done the same thing had the tables been turned. That's just something we don't know. But that decision also made a big difference in the 2016 election ultimately, because they built on it by offering up a list of people who Donald Trump might nominate to the Supreme Court. galvanizing a lot of support among social conservatives, creating a lot of energy in a space that really helped Trump be elected. Now, one would normally think that would lead to a wonderful allegiance of two people whose interests aligned and they both won. I guess it played out that way for a little while. But then it became pretty clear to Senator McConnell that they were dealing with a very unusual person in terms of the way he operated in the president. So Senator McConnell adopted the position of, I'm going to do what I can do. And one of the questions I asked of him, I said, there are some people who say you were the enabler of Donald Trump. And Senator McConnell said, he was my enabler, that he was able to use Trump for what he wanted to do. The first illustration of that was with the tax bill that Senator McConnell and then Speaker Paul Ryan got together and they decided, we'll call it the Trump tax cut. That will help us sell this at the White House. And they did, and they got it passed on a party line vote. So that worked for him. But then there were other times when legislation wouldn't get passed because of the filibuster, and President Trump would hector Leader McConnell on Twitter, Mitch, you've got to get rid of the filibuster, or we got to go to 50. And that's an area where Senator McConnell just didn't do it. He didn't bend on that because he thought the filibuster was so important. And as many of you know, in private, he was expressing some very deep thoughts about President Trump and his capacity. And for those of you who've read the book, you kind of know what some of those are. And it's important to note that he does these, he talked to me about a lot of this, but even before that, like circa 2018, he is saying these things in his oral histories. And his oral histories initially, he did those because he wanted to have that record. And his plan was to not release them until he was out of office. So he changed his mind. And I'm eternally grateful for that, because when you get a document like that, you feel like this has got to be pretty close to honest, right? This isn't just self-serving because he thinks it's going to be released when it no longer matters to him politically. So I found them very candid and extremely helpful. So still, President Trump, doesn't give President or Leader McConnell credit for this. But if you look at his record and ask yourself, okay, what's some of the impact it had? Why is he consequential? Why do I say that he's the most consequential Senate leader since Lyndon Johnson? You could draw a straight line between his engineering of the Supreme Court and the overturning of Roe. You could draw a straight line between that and the overturning of affirmative action. You can draw a straight line between that and the Chevron decision, which rolled back a lot of the regulatory framework of the federal government. Now, if you're a liberal Democrat, that's a real problem for you. If you're a conservative Republican, that's a pretty formidable list of accomplishments that very few other people could match. So that's what he did when he tried to pull that off. The Trump era has been a challenging one for him in many respects, as we know. There was January the 6th. And before that, when the Electoral College was going to meet, Senator McConnell said, we have to acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect. And I do, and I congratulate him. And, a short time later, he got a scalding phone call from Donald Trump. And essentially, the two have never spoken since. So this is from December 2020 to today. You could argue they had a perfunctory handshake in the Senate, maybe grunted a hello or something, but really, they haven't spoken. After January 6th, he was furious about what happened. He thought that his staff had been put in danger, that the country had been put in danger. But then, to those who are asking the question, then why didn't he vote to convict him in the impeachment trial? So that's a fair question. And I'll give you his answer. His answer was twofold. There was a legal answer, which was nobody who had ever left office had been impeached and convicted. It was only for people who were holding federal office. So that's a legal rationale. And he also had a political rationale. And the political rationale was, and certainly I think most people would have agreed with this at the time, Trump may be a spent force. We need the energy of the Republican base as we go into the midterm elections. So if we go through this, then that base will be depressed and we will lose. So politics is a tough game. And it's important to remind folks that, you know, the Senate leader is not in the Constitution. The Speaker of the House is in the Constitution, in the line of succession for the presidency. So it really, it is a partisan job almost by its very nature. And Senator McConnell certainly was quite a partisan. But it's interesting when I talk to a lot of senators, and one of the people I enjoyed speaking with was Angus King, who's an independent from Maine, but he caucuses with the Democrats. And he talked about, he has these rib dinners where he has people of both parties over and they, you know, have a glass of wine and a steak and enjoy it. And he said, the problem for Senator McConnell is his obstructions are notorious and nobody knows about his bipartisan work. So I will say that there was quite a bit of that in the Biden era. The infrastructure bill and the Brent Spence Bridge, which you guys have all probably been over a million times, would not have happened without Senator McConnell. The CHIPS Act, which President Trump says he wants to repeal, but other people think is a really good idea to build semiconductors in this country. That was Senator McConnell. The gun safety bill, all those things would not have happened without Senator McConnell. And the thing that he did that I think gives a little bit of lie to the idea that he only cared about power for the sake of power was when he fought for aid for Ukraine. He knew that there was a chance that Donald Trump would win, and he knew that that would mean probably not good things for aid to Ukraine. So he put himself on the line for that. And he got enough other Republicans to do it, to go with him. He withstood the fire from Trump, from J.D. Vance, from the other restive, you know, right side of his conference, and he did it. And strategically, he wanted it to be enough money to sustain Ukraine for at least a year. And I think without question, given everything that's happened, if Ukraine wouldn't have had that money, we might be in a very different situation today. But there's always a price that you pay for power, which is, you know, the title of the book. And I have to be honest, he did not like that title. I think his staff thought something more like "Make Room on Mount Rushmore" or something like that. But I think it fits because there is a price to be paid for it. And sometimes you pay for it personally, sometimes you pay for it politically. And he came to power at a time when the parties were going through a real ideological sword. You know, there aren't very many moderate Democrats. There aren't very many moderate Republicans. Everybody is, you know, on one side or the other. And so there's not a lot of room there. But he's also looking at a party now that doesn't resemble the party that he joined and doesn't resemble the party of Ronald Reagan, where there's clearly a more isolationist strain to the Republican agenda right now. The tariffs, you know, sort of go totally against the orthodoxy of free trade, which is something Republicans believe in. So you have a man who less than a year ago held extraordinary power and now sometimes finds himself almost standing alone in his point of view. I mean, he was one of very few senators to oppose any nominees for the cabinet. If you read his floor speeches, he is giving a loud and clear message about his views on the war and the role of Russia in the world in particular. So he is fighting a fight, but this time it's more of a lonely one. But he has two important positions still. One is on a subcommittee that helps with defense appropriations, which is very important. And the other will probably try to ensure the integrity of the filibuster, which one can certainly imagine will come under threat if some things that the president wants don't get passed because of the filibuster. He will put the same pressure on John Thune that he did on McConnell and say, you need to get rid of the filibuster. It's interesting talking to Senator McConnell now. Um, there's almost a certain serenity about where he is because he feels liberated. He's not burdened by what does my party need me to do. And then one funny thing he said to me the other day, he goes, my stock is certainly rising among Democrats. So there we are. Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Tackett, I enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
Um, I remember thinking, when he stepped down as majority leader, I remember thinking to myself that was the beginning of the end. I find this to be a very fascinating subject. And we've watched Mitch McConnell's mastery of the Senate over the years. So my question, is there anyone else in the Senate that you think will fill the void, will fill that leadership void? Who do you think will be the next master of the Senate?
Boy, that's a great question. I think John Thune has certainly been an understudy for several years, so he knows the parameters of the job. People, I don't know him well, but people who do think that he's a strong presence, that his manner is mild, but his views are strong. So it could be that person. It's not in fashion today to be an institutionalist. It's more in fashion to be an influencer. It's like there's this documentary that called The Swamp that was, I think it came out in 2017 with Matt Gaetz, was the star of it. And unsurprisingly, he was meeting with the staff in the morning and he said, what do we have to do to get on Fox tonight? Not what are we going to do to legislate, not what are we going to do to make the country better, but what are we going to do to get on Fox? And so there are those competing factions, within Congress where it could be maddening to try to watch that, but it's also the age we live in, so it's kind of undeniable.
Since I traveled up from Indianapolis, I had to have one question. There's probably not enough space or room in national politics for appreciation of ironies. But my question is the irony ever appreciated for someone like Majority Leader McConnell, who is such a fighter for democracy, not just for freedom, but in his fight for democracy, he is the leader of probably the most anti-democratic institution of our government, and that's the US Senate, with the 60-vote filibuster rule and the institution itself, which is somewhat or is indeed anti-democratic.
Well, I wish he was here to answer that because I'm sure he would have a great rejoinder, but I think he would probably say that the founders set the country up that way for a reason, that they wanted the Senate to be different from the House. They didn't want it to be just the whims of every 2 years and major things changing. They wanted a more deliberative approach to government. And it's interesting how it's usually the party that's in the minority says, boy, we really need to get rid of that filibuster. And the party that's in the majority rather says, we ought to do that. And the minority party thinks, well, that's not such a bad idea. I mean, last year, Senator Schumer was talking about why they should get rid of the filibuster, and I have not heard him say that lately.
Hello, my name is Charles Barr. I'd like to ask you, did you have any insight from Senator McConnell on who he would like his successor to be and who he thinks his successor will be?
I don't, which I know is a very unsatisfying answer because I know that's a big question. I mean, I guess what I would say is, he's been the subject of a few punches already in that regard. And honestly, I'd be surprised if he took any stance at all in the primary.
Just wondering if you got a chance at all to talk to his family the mother of his daughters, or the daughters themselves?
There it is, the tough question. That's a very fair question. And I can tell you that I attempted, and what's in the book was what I was able to get from that. You know, I think people, it's a question a lot of people have. And one of the things that was valuable for me in the archives was there were letters. So there were letters from Cheryl Redmond to McConnell's parents. And so I at least got a picture of what life was like then. And, you know, I think his family thinks, you know, they have their relationship, and I gave it a good try, and I came up short on that one.
I wanted to respond to one thing about your comment on his position of being in control. He was the reason I ran for Congress, and I did not win the first time, and he was the reason I ran the second time. And he was a facilitator of phenomenal contact and fundraising, but he never exerted or any control. But I did have the pleasure of one of his very strong staff, a woman, he sent to Louisville to be my campaign manager the first time around. And I know several of his previous staff. So I wondered how many of your, if you interviewed and talked to his staff and previous staff members.
Yeah, quite a few. And I don't know if you're referring to Janet Mullins, but Janet Mullins, you know, from Louisville, was the campaign manager for Senator McConnell in 1984, and was also his first Senate chief of staff. One tough person. She passed away from pancreatic cancer not too long ago, but I interviewed her, I think 3 times, you know, before she passed away. And I interviewed as many current and former staff as I could, you know, it's in the dozens. So I think I got a sense of how it worked. But one of the things that was interesting is, you know, in the Senate and in Congress, sometimes the people have a lovely outward persona on TV. They seem really nice, but to their staff, they're not really very nice. I did not hear that about Senator McConnell. I mean, there may be a disgruntled staff person out there, but most of his staff is intensely loyal to him.
Good evening. Are you able to give us any insight as to how Senator McConnell views the Doge regime and people like the new head of OMB, Russell Vought, who wants to traumatize the federal workforce? Appreciate whatever you can offer.
I haven't seen a lot of public statements about that, but I know that he expressed a concern to me that he said, you know, there are a lot of people in my party that just don't believe in government. Like, they just don't believe in it. They think it, you know, shouldn't do very much. And, you know, he believed that government could do a lot of things. And, you know, people in Kentucky know that he brought home a lot to the state of Kentucky in the billions and billions of dollars. And one of the things he said that I thought was kind of funny, he said, my idea of pork is a project in Indiana. Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tackett, for your work on this biography of Senator McConnell. I wanted to ask you, Senator McConnell has once said one of his most favorite words in the dictionary is focus. He's a very focused man. And he would also know before he brought something to the Senate floor if he would have the votes or not. And oftentimes, if he didn't, he wouldn't bring it. One of the big moments of his tenure is when they tried to repeal Obamacare. And then we saw Senator John McCain at the time give the famous thumbs down. So I was wondering, in your talks with Senator McConnell, how he felt after that, because he was for sure that they would have the votes and he did not.
Well, again, going back to the control issue, it's like just when you think you know, and then that's one of the very few times I think he was probably genuinely surprised where something didn't happen that he thought was going to happen. And that's an area that, you know, sometimes when you do a project like this, you go back and you think about areas that you wish you would have explored a little bit more. And healthcare is one of those areas because, I mean, from what I've read and what you all live, that Kentucky Connect was actually a fairly successful, popular program for people. They just wisely didn't label it Obamacare, and then everybody thought it was okay. But yeah, that's an area where I think he was surprised, and an area that I wish I would have explored even more.
Got a question that's come in from a virtual viewer. Thank you for researching, writing the book. And the question actually goes into legacy in a couple of different aspects. One,
Did this chat come in on Signal or anything? Too soon?
we've talked a lot about national legacy, and this frames a couple of different legacy questions. How do we think McConnell will be remembered by Kentuckians? And does he stand a chance in terms of international legacy of catching up to Muhammad Ali?
I'm gonna give a hard no on number two. You know, because who could? That'd be really hard. The first part of the question was about his Senate legacy in Kentucky. Yeah, I think without question, although it's dangerous for me to say this at a historical society, he's one of the easily top three most influential politicians in Kentucky history, you know, with Henry Clay and Alvin Barkley. There's not much doubt about that. And, you know, politicians can leave their legacies in a lot of ways, you know, like you could have the Mitch McConnell running trail, the Mitch McConnell forest, or, I mean, you could travel the state and you will find something probably attributable to his action in the Senate.
Thank you for joining us today. I wanted to follow up the question on legacy. I was curious if you had any insight into what Senator McConnell hoped his legacy would be. And I also wanted to ask what you think after your time in the archives, his legacy will be.
Yeah, I think he sees himself as somebody who did what a party leader is supposed to do. You know, he fought the good fight. He won more than he lost. He realized that it's a difficult job. And he also realized later in his career, you know, in the last year or so, that the party kind of left him, and he's sort of acknowledged that. I think his legacy will be of being very consequential, impactful on American life, a very skilled tactician, a very skilled politician, and someone who, not all the time, but someone who occasionally put all that aside for something he really believed in, like the struggle in Ukraine.
I was just curious, after serving parallel terms and years together, if he had any kind of either a working relationship or a personal relationship with Joe Biden.
The answer to that is yes, not necessarily in the way that you might think. They weren't really friends when they were in the Senate together, but they kind of became more friendly when Biden was vice president. And they did deals with each other, and, you know, significant negotiations. And then Senator McConnell was the only Republican in Congress who went to Beau Biden's funeral. And President Biden never forgot that. And I interviewed President Biden for the book in December of 2023 in the Oval Office. And he was really, you know, he was pretty complimentary. He said, you know, you might disagree with him, but if he told you something, that's what it was. If he told you he had the votes, he had the votes. If he told you this is his position, it was his position. And then occasionally, as I had said, they found common ground, like on the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS bill, the gun safety bill, among other things. So a politician's career is a ledger. You know, there are entries on both sides. It's too easy to say somebody is all one thing or all another thing.
I'm going to struggle a little bit, so bear with me, but what is Mitch McConnell's opinion on the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? And I realize there's no easy answer to that,
traditionally, I think the Republican Party wants more power with the states, and the Democratic Party wants more power with the federal government. I know over the years, each party has had their own conservative wing and liberal wing. That's changed over the years. So, what do you think Mitch McConnell thinks is the real difference between the two parties?
Well, I mean, I think he's a pretty orthodox Reagan Republican. Strong national defense, limited government, free trade. He thinks that Democrats spend too much money and practice too much identity politics.
At what stage in the process is the entire book presented to Senator McConnell to review? If you could share some light on what some of the initial reactions of his
Sure.
was to the book.
Well, that's an easy answer because I didn't give it to him. And that was the whole idea, was that, from day one, it's not going to be seen as credible if somebody has a sort of a right of refusal on parts of it. And so what I did do, in all candor, was I got a few copies of the book like 3 or 4 days before it was actually in bookstores. And so at that point, it's published, right? It's in print, so nobody can change it. So I did give it to him then. And I mean, I had no idea what his reaction was going to be, because I've had some people who say, boy, you really, scalded him. And some people who said, man, you were really soft on him. And so you're not going to win. People bring their opinions to it. But I will say I was heartened, because he called me at one point and he said, he just read like the first 3 chapters. He goes, I'm learning things about my family I didn't know. So I thought, well, I'll call that a win. And then when he was finished with it, he goes, there's some things I disagree with, but I have to say, I think it was fair. So I thought, well, okay, I can live with that.
Well, y'all, I think that about runs us out of time. Thank you all so much for the really wonderful questions. Another round of applause.